Hello, this is a summary of my doctoral dissertation, The Motivational Effect of Compassion on Securing Narrative Engagement. My research question was this: why do we purposely seek to experience sadness with fiction when sadness is an aversive emotional state in real life? I wanted to begin by showing you this, to help everyone feel rather than just understand the subject. This is one of the most famous scenes from Mexican cinema. Pepe el Toro mourning the death of his child after a fire that destroyed his home. From Ustedes los ricos, you the wealthy. The movie is the second film in a trilogy that began with Nosotros los Pobres, We the Poor. The trilogy follows Pepe el Toro, a poor carpenter, taking care of his paraplegic mother and raising his estranged sister's daughter as his. Throughout the trilogy, Pepe el Toro gets robbed, his mother is murdered, his sister dies of tuberculosis, his niece/daughter abandons him, he goes to jail for a crime he didn't commit, his child dies in a fire, his wife dies, one of his friends is murdered, and when he finally succeeds as a boxer, he accidentally kills his best friend. Needless to say, the trilogy was a commercial success. In English, these kind of stories are often described as heartbreaking. In Spanish, we say that the story is desgarradora, harrowing, that not only aches but tears our insides. Rather than being a deterrence to consumption, these and similar terms are often used to promote films and novels. It is as if suggesting that we will feel pain guaranteed the good quality of a story. Indeed, Oliver and colleagues found that while viewership was higher for films such as comedies and action movies, acclaim tended to be higher for films of a sad or dark and contemplative nature, films that provoked the experience of negative affect. This phenomenon, deriving gratification from the consumption of sad content, has been called the sadness paradox, the seemingly contradictory idea that humans work to minimize the experience of sadness, yet they find it pleasurable in an aesthetic context. The question is why? Why do we enjoy consuming sad stories when sad stories make us sad? Doing research is like connecting the dots placed on the paper by someone else. You sit atop a pile of evidence and theoretical propositions that at first glance seem to point in different directions but that altogether make sense. My research reconciled evidence from the media psychology and communications literature with propositions from flow theory, the transportation imagery model, and cognitive neuroscience, as well as with models of altruism from positive psychology, ethology, and behavioral economics. Rather than coming up with a new explanation, I came up with a unifying explanation that renders the sadness paradox as non existent. In brief, my answer to the sadness paradox is that while sad stories can make us sad, they can also make us feel compassion, which incentivizes narrative engagement, and that we derive gratification from how it feels like to be engaged. Of course, I didn't come up with this answer from thin air. I started by reviewing the existing proposed solutions to the sadness paradox. Excitation transfer theory proposes that we consume sad content because experiencing negative affect provides higher emotional intensity to the experience of positive affect. David and colleagues exposed participants to a sad film, Still Magnolias, and found a strong association between experienced sadness and enjoyment, mediated by trait empathy. They proposed that happy endings provoke a hedonic reversal from distress to enjoyment that was higher for those who were more empathetic. At an intuitive level, this proposition makes sense, but why would this affective reversal occur? And what about stories with unhappy endings? Zillman's mood management theory proposes that we consume media to improve or enhance a current mood. To reconcile mood management theory with the consumption of content that provokes negative affect, Zillman proposed that we consume content that may be unpleasant to acquire valuable information that will dissipate an aversive state now or in the future. This would include important life lessons, but also finding out whether Cinderella will marry the prince. That is, we may consume sad stories to satisfy our curiosity. But then, why would we invest hours following the misadventures of a stranger when time and attention are scarce resources? What utility do we derive from it? Zillman also proposed that we may use sad stories to improve our self-esteem by comparing our circumstances to those of others. He cites evidence from a study by Mattes and Cantor, who found that lonely older adults' well-being improved more after watching a sad documentary than after watching a happy one. Oliver and colleagues propose that we consume sad content following eudaimonic motivations when sad content is appraised as meaningful. Oliver and colleagues defined meaningful content as that conducive to happiness by embodying the moral virtues such as justice, courage, gentleness, generosity, and truthfulness, and the intellectual virtues such as knowledge, wisdom, and intuition. They also propose that rather than finding meaningful content enjoyable, we appreciate it, and that appreciation rises from experiencing compassion, human connectedness, and mixed affect, also referred as mixed emotions, ambivalent affect, or as being moved by Bartsch and colleagues. Oliver and colleagues argued that we appreciate meaningful content because it satisfies our need for cognition, self-reflection, and purpose, and because it helps us understand issues of mortality. After Erzner, Hirschfeld, and colleagues, who, following basic categories of emotions, proposed that poignant events provoke a mixture of happiness and sadness, Oliver and colleagues proposed that experiencing mixed affect predicts the experience of meaningful affect. Bartsch and colleagues found that individuals who experienced the stronger negative and ambivalent feelings while consuming drama or horror films also enjoyed the experiences the best. Thus, they proposed that the gratification that sad content provides comes from a secondary positive appraisal of negative emotions, which they called meta-emotions, as in this movie must be good because it makes me feel bad. Following convention, Bartsch defined mixed or ambivalent affect as feeling happy and sad at the same time, and proposed that empathetic sadness is a meta-emotion that brings gratification. Oliver and Bartsch noted that while content that we appreciate tends to be sad, sad content is not always meaningful, therefore departing from the finding of meaning as the only solution to the sadness paradox. A good example would be tearjerkers, such as Mexican telenovelas, which tend to be campy and over the top. The addiction-like enthusiasm with which audiences around the world consume this kind of stories suggests that appreciation alone cannot fully explain the sadness paradox. We seem to not only appreciate sad stories, but to crave them too. Meninghaus and colleagues ran a study in which they found that sad stories tend to be more memorable when they move us. They describe feelings of being moved as those elicited by life-significant events, art, and nature that result in feelings of attachment, empathy and compassion, self-gratification, and improved well-being, and that promote approaching, attending, helping, and bonding as behavioral responses. Also following convention, Meninghaus and colleagues classified feelings of being moved as a mixture of the basic emotions of sadness and joy. Notwithstanding this classification, Meninghaus and colleagues stated that the profile for being moved was significantly different from the sadness profile and also from the joy profile, and admit that being moved belongs to the attachment, bonding, empathy emotions. Previously, Hanich and colleagues had proposed that we consume sad stories because sad stories move us, and being moved is an overall positive experience rousing from the appreciation of prosocial behavior, acts of forgiveness, sacrifice, and generosity. They rejected the concept of meta emotions and meaningfulness as a requirement to obtain pleasure from sad content consumption and argued that we derive gratification from the positive component of the bittersweet feelings of being moved. Using the example of the movie 21 Grams, they suggested that plot events containing prosocial scenes have a positive effect on mood that overcomes the negative effect of distressful plot events. They propose that sadness adds a negative flavor that intensifies the mixed but overall positive emotional experience of being moved, making it more enjoyable, and state that without any prosocial act, a sad film would simply be depressing but not moving. But then, what about extremely sad stories with an unhappy ending? For instance, Son of Saul, the story of a man interned in a Nazi concentration camp, trying to give a proper Jewish burial to his son. Son of Saul is a hard to watch film with hardly any prosocial scene that would evoke positive affect, yet one of the most acclaimed films from recent years. How could so much sadness enhance the flavor of happiness? To provide a solution to this paradox, Meninghaus and colleagues developed the distancing embracing model of the enjoyment of negative emotions in art reception, which proposes that we can enjoy negative affect provoked by art when we recognize its harmless nature. For instance, when admiring Picasso's Guernica instead of seeing the ruins of the village of Guernica bombed by the Nazis. The model makes negative affect a necessary condition for enjoyment because its interplay with positive affect prevents consumers from experiencing boredom and contributes to enjoyment by allowing for higher emotional intensity, and that feelings of being moved arise when circumstances that cause sadness also foster bonding and attachment. However, Woskowski and Irola pointed out the contradiction of including a distancing factor in the model when evidence suggests that empathy is a necessary condition for enjoyment, that greater immersion translates to greater enjoyment, and that there is a positive association between trait empathy, emotional intensity, and enjoyment of sad art. That is, how could distancing allow for enjoyment when enjoyment seems tied to approach? In summary, what previous findings suggest is that the observed positive association between experiencing sadness and gratification is actually mediated by feelings of being moved. That what Oliver and colleagues describe as meaningful affect and what Meninghaus and colleagues described as being moved is pretty much the same affective state, a state linked to the experience of sadness, but that promotes approach and interest for the other rather than isolation, that invites to further reflection, and that is inherently pleasant, yet different from flat out joy or happiness. And that individuals higher in empathic traits tend to enjoy sad stories the most, which explains why women, who tend to be more empathetic than men, show a stronger preference for sad stories. Nevertheless, the recipient remains aware that sad content is harmless to the self, as the distancing embracing model proposes. It all points to feelings of compassion as the source for a meaningful or moved affective state. Compassion is a concern for the welfare of the other. Cassell calls it a kind of love whose desire is to help, to do things for its object, and to obtain the knowledge and information necessary for right action. Some authors prefer the term empathic concern, sympathy, or just empathy. I prefer compassion because its meaning is straightforward and because I strongly believe that one must distinguish between empathy and compassion. However we label the feeling, the important thing is that we understand the kind of behavior it motivates. We tend to assume that sad content will make us sad, that when transported we feel what the character feels. However, sadness is not the typical empathic response to witnessing others' distress. compassion is. This is not to say that sad stories won't make us sad, but that they are more likely to make us feel compassion than just sadness. To understand why this is so, it is necessary to make a difference between empathy and compassion. Empathy is an emotional reaction to the state of others. It is subjective and particular to the individual. When transported by a story, we don't feel what the character feels, but react to our perception of the character's affective state or circumstances. Empathic responses are congruent to the other's state, yet neutral. Watching someone else laugh can make us laugh too, but it could also make us feel anger, mortification, or annoyance if we interpret the other's laughter as mocking. That is, the nature of our empathic responses rely on interpretation. Both compassion and sadness are congruent responses to witnessing others' distress. Nevertheless, each motivates markedly different behavioral responses. Sadness leads to a drooping posture, negative talk, negative thoughts, withdrawal, low arousal, low interest, and serves as a punishing reinforces to avoid sadness inducing situations in the future. Compassion inspires affiliation and promotes increased interest, as well as helping, comforting, and approaching the other. Moreover, compassion's connection with the mesolimbic reward system suggests that circumstances that elicit compassion may be purposely sought rather than avoided. As a precursor of a meaningful or moved state, compassion could be categorized as meaningful affect following Oliver's definition, but it is not the same as mixed affect if mixed affect is defined as feeling happy and sad at the same time. Following convention, mixed affect, ambivalent affect, or feelings of being moved have been categorized as a mixture of two basic emotions based on categories initially proposed by Darwin and later popularized by Ekman and Plotchnik. However, basic emotion categories fail to capture the essence of what a meaningful or moved state entails. Being moved may feel like joy and sadness blended together, but it promotes markedly different behavior than these two emotions. Happiness invites to play, sadness to withdraw, compassion to help and comfort. For that reason, I rejected this basic emotions categorization and instead ascribed my research to functional accounts of emotions when developing my thesis. Functional accounts of emotions define emotions in terms of solutions to problems. According to Ledoux, emotions are the expression of neural circuits involved in defense, maintenance of energy and nutritional supplies, fluid balance, thermoregulation, and reproduction. Both basic emotions theories and functional accounts of emotions agree with appraisal theories in the sense that emotional responses follow the appraisal of an event. The difference is that functional accounts do not categorize emotional responses in terms of feelings, facial expressions, or labels imposed by language, but in terms of resulting behavior. It is hard to describe what compassion feels like. It feels bad, but not as bad as sadness, and yet a little bit good too. However, it is not difficult to describe the kind of behavior that feeling compassion motivates. Compassion motivates altruism, behavior done primarily in the benefit of the other. Now, you cannot help a character in distress because you cannot change his story. Thus, in the case of stories, what I propose is that compassion promotes narrative engagement as a way to acquire information about the welfare of the other. The question then becomes, why would feeling compassion dictate what we do? Why would we invest the scarce resources of time and attention following a stranger's struggle? Why would we embrace a character's goals? Our original purpose when consuming media content may be that of improving our mood, as mood management theory proposes. Every time we start watching a film or reading a novel, there is a willingness to engage with the content and consequently to accept the character's goals. However, our willingness may not be sufficient. Some stories fail to engage. I argue that compassion makes us engage because compassion follows a primal urge to comfort the other. My argument follows Preston and Duvall's perception action model of empathy, which they developed from observations of animal behavior. The model proposes that perceiving others' state automatically translates to an internal motor representation of that state, which then leads to the appropriate autonomic and somatic responses which constitute an emotional episode. That is, for a brief moment, our brains mimic the state of the other. We feel like we perceive that the other feels, then develop an emotional response congruent to our simulation of the other's state. Empathy born from motor mimicry is common among social animals. Empathic responses also arise from perspective taking, a representation of the other's state born from an understanding of the circumstances of the other. Perspective taking has only been observed in hominoids. Compassion is a typical empathic response to witnessing others' distress, but not the only possible response. We feel compassion if we perceive the other's distress as undeserved. If we perceive that the distress is deserved, our empathic response may be antipathy, or we may acknowledge the other's suffering but just don't care, which seems to be the typical case for psychopathic individuals. Similarly, compassion leads to altruism only when the cost of helping the other is assessed as worthy of our efforts. If the cost of helping the other is assessed as too high, our response is not altruism but avoidance. The decision between altruism and avoidance is fast, mainly implicit, and biased toward approaching and helping unless the cost of approaching is assessed as too high. That is, altruism derives from a cost-benefit analysis of the consequences of acting on sympathetic impulses. To explain why compassion sometimes leads to altruism and other times to avoidance, Preston proposed a model of altruistic behavior homologous to the offspring care in rats. The circumstances that would prompt altruistic behavior would be a natural attraction toward neonatal vulnerability, the saliency of the other's distress, motor competency and expertise, and a rewarding effect to close social contact that incentivizes approach. Preston proposes that at a physiological level, the decision to help is regulated by the excitatory or inhibitory effect of the amygdala on two divergent pathways. The first is an avoidance route that activates the anterior hypothalamus and the periaqueductal gray, promoting avoidance and defensive responses. The second is an approach route that activates the medial preoptic area of the hypothalamus, inhibits its anterior area, and activates the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. Preston proposes that higher levels of oxytocin play a facilitating role to the approach response by activating the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, and by suppressing social avoidance by acting on the amygdala and the periaqueductal gray. There is a plethora of evidence linking the neurotransmitter oxytocin to approach behavior. Oxytocin promotes maternal attachment in mammals, pairing in monogamous species, affiliation with non-offspring, and synchronized movement. Additionally, studies using intranasal oxytocin have found that a link between oxytocin and generosity. Because of this, oxytocin has been nicknamed the love hormone. However, it wouldn't be correct to adjudicate altruistic behavior to the effect of one neurotransmitter alone. Research suggests that the effect of oxytocin in promoting altruism is indirect by reducing stress. For instance, Singer and colleagues found that inhaling oxytocin did not increase generosity on selfish individuals, but merely decreased amygdala reactivity, as predicted by Preston's model. Zach and Barraza found the effect of oxytocin on generosity was mediated by an individual's self-reported levels of compassion. The increased interest that characterizes compassion may be driven by the combined effect of adrenocorticoids and dopamine. Evidence from neuroscience research suggests that altruistic responses are linked to the activation of the areas of the brain associated with attention and reward processing through involvement of the mesocortical and mesolimbic dopamine pathways. My study did not measure for the effect of oxytocin, dopamine, or stress hormones, but based on others' research as well as Preston's model, the association may be like this. Witnessing others' distress results in an empathic response that translates to the release of oxytocin, adrenocorticoids, and dopamine, producing feelings of compassion, fostering attention, and promoting engagement. The effect of the adrenocorticoids would also result in some personal distress, which may lead to disengagement. However, this effect would be downregulated by the effect of oxytocin. Per the dopamine prediction error hypothesis, dopaminergic neurons in the mesolimbic pathway will fire more frequently in response to unexpected rewards, lower their firing rate to predicted rewards, and have an almost null rate of firing in response to a lack of reward. The higher the prediction error, the higher the release of dopamine, and thus the lesser the inclination to disengage attention. The role of conflict may be that of keeping compassion for a character alive and therefore engagement by increasing uncertainty and suspense. Thus, like excitation transfer theory and the distancing embracing model propose, negative affect is necessary to prevent boredom and increase emotional intensity. Returning to these research claims, my argument is that compassion incentivizes narrative engagement and that we derive gratification from how it feels like to be engaged, from the somatic changes felt during the transporting experience. Feelings are the conscious perception of these somatic changes caused by the release of neurochemicals during an emotional episode. Adrenocorticoids would increase attention but also stress. Oxytocin would promote approach by reducing the stress of approaching the other. Dopamine promotes attention and exploratory behavior and translates to feelings of excitement and euphoria associated with the anticipation of a reward, but euphoria alone cannot explain the experience of pleasure, which is dependent on reward acquisition. Feelings of pleasure and analgesia are caused by endorphins, following consummatory behavior. The combined effect of all these neurotransmitters, but especially endorphins, may be responsible for the feelings of connectedness and elevation characteristic of a meaningful or moved state. Research has demonstrated that positive social contact increases the release of endorphins in the cerebrospinal fluid and thus the experience of positive affect. Therefore, I suspected an association between endorphin release and gratification. Recent research suggests that such association exists. Dunbar, Thompson, and colleagues ran a series of studies in which they exposed participants to a sad story, then measured for the release of endorphins indirectly via changes in pain thresholds. They expected pain thresholds to change due to the analgesic effect of endorphins. They asked participants to do Roman chairs before and after the movie and found out that narrative transportation was positively associated with changes in pain threshold, sense of belongingness, the experience of both positive and negative affect, identification, and narrative persuasion. In a study that assessed for the pleasantness of listening to music, Malik and colleagues found that participants who took naltrexone, an opioid antagonist, experienced music anhedonia. Additionally, two models of social motivation can explain why sad content resulting in the experience of personal distress can still be considered gratifying, as well as the association between need for affect and gratification found by Barcht and colleagues, and excitation transfer theories, hedonic reversal from distress to enjoyment. The brain opioid theory of social attachment, or BOTSA, proposes that social isolation reduces basal levels of endorphins, while social contact promotes their release. Thus, feeling isolation induces a preference toward social contact as a way to procure comfort. Likewise, the state-dependent mu-opioid modulation of social motivation model, SOM, proposes that during a distressful state, decreased activation of the mu-opioid receptors in the brain, which have a high affinity for endorphins, promotes social contact as a way to reduce pain. Hence, reaching a moved state may be preceded by a craving for social contact as a way to procure comfort that results from bonding with story characters. Increased bonding would explain in turn increased engagement. In other words, story recipients may choose to stick to a sad story, painful as it may be, in hopes of a comforting, happy ending. Thus, coming up to my study, my first hypothesis was that there is a positive association between compassion and engagement mediated by the experience of personal distress. I expected that the more distress that recipients experienced, the more likely that they would disengage. I defined compassion as the degree to which a story recipient develops an empathic concern for the welfare of a story character. Compassion was assessed using an 11-item 5-point Likert type scale adapted from McDormand and Davis's empathic concern scales. I defined engagement as a commitment of time and attention in a potentially rewarding task leading to a loss of awareness of one's surroundings. Since engagement is a precondition to narrative transportation, engagement was assessed by the degree to which participants feel transported into a narrative using an 8-item 5-point Likert type scale adapted from the transportation scale short form by Appel, Nams, Richter, and Green, and from McDormand's. Finally, I defined personal distress as the degree to which a story recipient feels personal discomfort as a consequence of being exposed to others' distress, assessed through a 9-item 5-point Likert type scale adapted from Davis's personal distress scale. Personal distress includes aversive feelings such as sadness and alarm, but also boredom, disgust, frustration, anger, and the like. My second hypothesis claimed that there is a positive association between engagement and being moved. I defined being moved as an affective state that is inherently pleasant and characterized by feelings of attachment, contemplation, introspection, compassion, self-gratification, and improved well-being. As described by Meninghaus and colleagues, the construct was assessed through a 9-item 5-point Likert type scale adapted from the last question of the Geneva Appraisal Questionnaire and the Meaningful Affect Scale used by Appel, Slater, and Oliver in a recent study. My third hypothesis claimed that there is a positive association between compassion and the gratification derived from consuming a story. I defined gratification as the degree to which a story recipient finds media content gratifying, assessed using a 10-item 5-point Likert type scale of descriptive adjectives varying in valence. For instance, interesting to dull, assessing for perceived quality. The scale was adapted from McDormand's enjoyment scale. Finally, I predicted that changes in the level of salivary interleukin 18 would be associated with gratification. I measured for interleukin 18 in saliva as a proxy for the activity of the mu-opioid receptors in the brain based on previous research by Prosin and colleagues who found a correlation between levels of interleukin 18 in plasma and activity of the mu-opioid receptors, and Lafrata, who found a correlation between plasma and salivary levels of interleukin 18. The study took place last December in Tampico, Mexico, at the main branch of Laboratorios Lister. Participants were recruited among students and the general public via distribution of an electronic pamphlet promoting the study at the local university in Tampico, Universidad del Noroeste, and across the branches of Laboratorios Lister, and via snowball sampling. Participants provided a saliva sample before watching a video. which for participants in the treatment group was the 22-minute-long film Removed 3, Love is Never Wasted, the story of a child removed from his mother and placed temporarily under foster care. There were 39 participants in this group. Participants in the control group, only 6, watched the 23-minute-long video Alan por el Mundo, Myanmar number 6. The video is an episode for a travel show. It was expected that it would arouse only mild positive affect. After the film ended, participants filled up a series of questionnaires to assess for compassion, engagement, gratification, and a meaningful or moved state. After 20 minutes, participants gave a second saliva sample. Then here we have the results. First, I ran an independent samples t-test to confirm that there were differences between the treatment, SAD video, and control groups. As expected, there was a statistically significant difference in felt compassion between groups, with participants in the treatment group, SAD content video, reporting higher levels of compassion than participants in the control group. Personal distress was also higher for the treatment group. Differences in engagement were not significant between groups. I marked that in red. Gratification was higher for participants in the control group, but participants in the treatment group reported a higher being moved score. The mean was 0.59. Then I ran partial correlations controlling for video and for changes in interleukin 18. The large numbers in blue, also underscore, are the significant correlations. Compassion correlated with engagement, gratification, and being moved. Engagement also correlated with gratification and being moved, and gratification also correlated with being moved. Personal distress did not correlate with any of the considered variables, probably because the video shown was not distressful enough to perturb any of the participants. Changes in the levels of interleukin 18 correlated with gratification significantly. The other correlations were not significant. A linear regression established that compassion statistically significantly predicted engagement, and that compassion accounted for 46.2% of the explained variability in engagement. The regression equation was engagement equals 0.86 plus 0.67 by compassion. Thus, there was support for H1, with the caveat that personal distress did not mediate the association between compassion and engagement. As said before, the film used as a stimulus may not have been distressful enough to encourage disengagement. Engagement did not significantly predict being moved for the control group. For the treatment group, a linear regression established that engagement statistically significantly predicted being moved, and that engagement accounted for 46.9% of the explained variability in being moved. Thus, there was support for hypothesis number 2. For the treatment group, a linear regression established that compassion statistically significantly predicted gratification, and that compassion accounted for 21.6% of the explained variability in gratification. The regression equation was gratification 2.34 plus 0.37 by compassion. Thus, there was support for hypothesis 3. As it would be expected, compassion also predicted being moved. And finally, the results from the physiological tests must be interpreted with caution. First, the association between salivary levels of interleukin 18 and activity of the mu-opioid receptors was presumed based on previous research and not directly measured. Then only 32 pairs of saliva samples were analyzed, all of them from the treatment group. Of these, only 19 showed detectable changes in the levels of interleukin 18, perhaps because saliva was not the optimal biomarker. Finally, interleukin 18's levels were, for the most part, below the detection range guaranteed by the manufacturer of the ELISA kit utilized as reliable. With this in consideration, a regression analysis showed that changes in interleukin 18 were negatively associated with gratification, accounting for 26.9% of the changes in gratification. Changes in interleukin 18 did not correlate significantly with any other variable. When compassion was added to the regression, the association remained significant. Together, compassion and changes in the levels of interleukin 18 explained 55.5% of the variability in gratification with adjusted R-square of 49.9%. The regression equation was gratification equals 2.29 minus 0.02 changes in interleukin 18 plus 40 by compassion. Nevertheless, since the measured levels of salivary interleukin 18 were below the range guaranteed by the manufacturer of the ELISA kit as valid, my measures may not be valid. Hypothesis 4 therefore could not be accepted. In brief, there was support for hypothesis 1 to 3. Hypothesis 4 was not rejected, but couldn't be supported either because the physiological data collected may not be valid. Study limitations. First, the small size of the sample, which also lacked cultural diversity, since all participants were Hispanics, although the global success of Latin American telenovelas and the fact that the film used as a stimulus was an American film hint a universality of responses to the dramatic genre. This universality cannot be assumed. Then, the questionable validity of the physiological measures. Future research should have a much larger and diverse sample and utilize a different biomarker. For instance, blood plasma, to confirm or refute the suspected association between changes in the levels of interleukin 18, endorphin release, and the gratification derived from consuming sad content. Likewise, the presumed effect of personal distress in promoting disengagement remains to be confirmed by future research. The findings from my research agree with previous studies that suggest that sad content inspires an affective response associated with sadness, but qualitatively different, that of being moved. This research's most significant contribution to the literature was to part from the assumption that a moved state corresponds to a mixture of primary emotions, feeling happy and sad at the same time, and instead highlight the link between a meaningful moved state and compassion as a typical empathic response to consuming sad content. Once compassion replaces sadness as a main consequence of consuming sad content, the connection with engagement becomes straightforward. We do not enjoy sad stories because they make us sad, but because they engage us, and that engagement is fueled by compassion and by a subjective assessment of whether investing our time and attention in the desired goal will pay off. Thus, rather than sadness enhancing the flavor of happiness, as Hanich and colleagues proposed, a few and scarce sprinkles of happiness may be what keeps compassion alive by increasing hope. We evolved to derive pleasure from increased social contact, especially when distressed, because securing social connection increases the likelihood of survival. Sad stories promote narrative engagement by taking advantage of our primal need to comfort and be comforted. Conflict's role is to secure attention by making happiness elusive, by squeezing and stretching hope. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention.